Case 1. June 3, 2011, Honolulu, Hawaii. Toby Stangl was identified after a series of random freeway shootings that unfolded during the afternoon commute, turning one of the state's busiest highways into a crime scene. Multiple emergency calls reported gunfire from a moving vehicle, and within minutes, traffic across the H1 freeway came to a standstill. One woman was killed, several drivers were injured, and the incident immediately drew statewide attention. Investigators quickly confirmed the shootings were unprovoked and random, with no known connection between the suspect and the victims. As details emerged, the focus shifted to identifying how an ordinary commute had escalated into deadly violence. The case began shortly after rush hour traffic intensified on the H1 freeway. Drivers reported hearing loud bangs and seeing shattered windows as bullets struck passing vehicles without warning. Some motorists abandoned their cars, while others attempted to escape by accelerating through traffic. Emergency dispatchers received dozens of calls within minutes, all describing a gunman firing from a moving vehicle. The reports placed the suspect traveling across multiple freeway segments, firing intermittently as traffic slowed. Police units were immediately dispatched and began coordinating road closures and pursuit efforts. Despite the rapid response, the chaos on the freeway made it difficult to locate the shooter. The randomness of the attacks suggested no clear motive or target, but the evidence at the scene did not match any known pattern of roadway violence. One of the victims was Tammy Ewan, a mother of 10 who was driving her minivan with her daughter seated beside her. Ewan had no criminal history, no disputes, and no connection to the suspect. She was traveling along the freeway as part of her normal routine when her vehicle was struck by gunfire. The injuries caused her to lose control, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. Her daughter survived but witnessed the aftermath of the shooting. Other victims included drivers in nearby lanes who were injured by shattered glass and bullet fragments. Investigators later confirmed that none of the victims had any prior contact with Stangl. The lack of connection reinforced that the violence was indiscriminate. It would take only days for the full scope of the attack to become clear. Law enforcement reconstructed the incident by combining ballistic evidence, witness accounts, and traffic camera footage. Spent shell casings recovered from multiple locations matched the same firearm. Witnesses described a vehicle weaving through lanes while shots were fired at random. Traffic cameras confirmed the suspect's route across the freeway and the sequence of the attacks. Investigators also reviewed emergency call timestamps to establish a precise timeline, determining the shooting spree lasted approximately 17 minutes. The evidence showed the suspect fired at civilian vehicles and later at responding police units. As the timeline came together, authorities were able to narrow down the suspect vehicle and track its movement in real time. Then, a critical sighting allowed officers to intervene directly. Police units eventually located Stangl's vehicle and initiated a coordinated effort to stop it. As officers attempted to close in, Stangl fired at patrol vehicles, escalating the threat. Law enforcement boxed in his car using multiple units, forcing it to a stop on the freeway. Stangl was taken into custody without further shots being fired. A search of his vehicle recovered firearms consistent with the ballistic evidence collected from the scene. Investigators confirmed that Stangl had acted alone. There were no accomplices and no prior warnings to authorities that indicated an imminent attack. When confronted with the evidence, his actions were clearly documented through physical findings and eyewitness accounts, leaving little ambiguity about responsibility. In 2013, Toby Stangl was convicted on multiple counts related to the shooting, including the killing of Tammy Ewan and the injuries to other drivers. The court rejected arguments centered on diminished capacity and focused on the deliberate nature of his actions. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms with a mandatory minimum of 60 years before parole eligibility. The sentencing emphasized the danger posed to the public and the lasting impact on the victims' families. The case prompted renewed discussion in Hawaii about mental health monitoring and intervention, particularly when signs of severe paranoia appear. Despite those discussions, the sentence ensured Stangl would remain incarcerated, as questions about prevention remained unresolved. Case 2. 2022, Honolulu, Hawaii. Juan Barron became the focus of a welfare check that led to the discovery of a body encased in concrete inside a residential bathtub. What initially appeared to be a routine check on an elderly homeowner quickly escalated into one of the most disturbing homicide investigations in recent Hawaiian history. The scene suggested deliberate planning rather than impulsive violence. As investigators secured the home, it became clear that the victim had been concealed for an extended period. Attention soon centered on Barron, a man who had been living inside the residence while the homeowner was missing. Authorities entered the residence after family members reported they could not reach 73-year-old Gary Ruby. Repeated phone calls had gone unanswered, and attempts to visit the home were deflected. Concerned relatives requested a welfare check, prompting police to enter the property. Inside, officers noticed signs that the home was being actively occupied despite Ruby's absence. The bathroom drew immediate attention due to the bathtub appearing sealed and unusually heavy. Further inspection revealed hardened concrete filling the tub. Once the concrete was broken apart, human remains were discovered. The condition of the scene suggested the body had been concealed for a significant amount of time. At that moment, the welfare checks officially became a homicide investigation. Gary Ruby was a retired homeowner who lived alone and maintained a quiet lifestyle. He had no known disputes and limited daily contact with others, making his absence less immediately noticeable. Investigators determined that Ruby had allowed Juan Barron into his home under circumstances that were not fully documented. There was no evidence of a formal caretaker agreement or rental arrangement. Ruby's isolation made him vulnerable, and his routine provided few external checks on his well-being. Friends and family later confirmed that Ruby was known to be trusting and generous. That vulnerability would ultimately become central to understanding how the crime occurred and how it went unnoticed for months. Investigators began reconstructing events using financial records, vehicle data, and forensic evidence from the residence. Bank and credit card activity showed transactions occurring after Ruby was last seen, none of which were consistent with his habits. Surveillance footage and license plate records confirmed that Barron had been driving Ruby's vehicle during this period. Inside the home, forensic analysis supported prolonged concealment rather than a recent death. The bathtub had been intentionally used as a containment site, suggesting efforts to prevent detection. The evidence showed not only a killing, but a sustained effort to assume Ruby's identity. Then, the pattern of impersonation became impossible to ignore. Juan Barron was taken into custody after investigators confronted him with the financial and forensic evidence. Faced with records showing months of impersonation, unauthorized vehicle use, and the physical evidence inside the home, Barron confessed. He admitted to killing Ruby and concealing his body in concrete. The confession aligned with the investigative findings and eliminated alternative explanations. Barron entered a plea rather than proceeding to trial, acknowledging responsibility for both the killing and the extended fraud that followed. The case shifted from determining what happened to evaluating how long the deception had been maintained and how it had gone undetected. Barron was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole, reflecting both the severity of the crime and the extended concealment that followed. The court emphasized the vulnerability of the victim and the calculated nature of the actions. After sentencing, Barron attempted to withdraw his plea, claiming procedural issues. The motion drew attention to broader concerns about elder abuse, isolation, and exploitation. While the conviction remained intact, the case prompted renewed discussion about safeguards for elderly individuals living alone. The bathtub, once a mundane feature of the home, became a symbol of deliberate concealment and prolonged deception. Case 3. 2013, Honolulu, Hawaii. A reported mailbox theft appeared at first to be a minor family dispute, but it quickly exposed a corruption scheme reaching the highest levels of local law enforcement. Louis Kiloha, the sitting Honolulu police chief, and his wife Catherine Kiloha, a deputy prosecutor, were soon identified as central figures. What began as a small property crime allegation evolved into a federal investigation, revealing abuse of power, fabricated evidence, and financial misconduct. The case drew intense public attention as investigators questioned how senior officials sworn to uphold the law had allegedly manipulated the justice system for personal gain. The case was set in motion after Gerard Piana, a family member, was arrested for the alleged theft of a mailbox belonging to Catherine Kiloha's grandmother. The arrest was based on evidence collected by the Honolulu Police Department and supported by prosecutorial action. Almost immediately, Piana insisted the accusation was false and that the incident had been staged. Investigators reviewing the case noted inconsistencies in police reports and unusual urgency in pursuing charges. What initially looked like a routine theft investigation soon raised questions about motive, credibility, and internal influence. As scrutiny increased, the focus shifted from the alleged theft itself to why the case had been handled so aggressively. Gerard Piana was not a stranger to the family. He was Catherine Kiloha's uncle and had been involved in disputes related to the care and finances of her elderly grandmother. Investigators later determined that the grandmother's finances had been systematically exploited, with funds diverted without her informed consent. Piana's growing concerns and inquiries threatened to expose the financial abuse. Rather than addressing those concerns, the evidence showed he was falsely accused and arrested. The power imbalance between Piana and the couple, one controlling police resource and the other prosecutorial authority, placed him at a severe disadvantage. It would take federal intervention to unravel what had occurred. Federal agents began examining financial records, communications, and internal police documentation. The investigation uncovered evidence of bank fraud, forged documents, and deliberate fabrication of police reports. Officers were found to have been directed to pursue false leads and suppress contradictory information. Investigators determined that police authority had been misused to legitimize the staged mailbox theft and silence a perceived threat. The scope of the misconduct expanded as agents identified obstruction of justice and false statements made to federal investigators. What emerged was not a single act of misconduct, but a coordinated effort to misuse public institutions for private protection. The FBI investigation culminated in indictments against both Louis and Catherine Kiloha. They were charged with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and related federal offenses. The indictments detailed how police resources were used to fabricate a crime and how legal authority was leveraged to sustain the false narrative. The arrests marked a dramatic fall for two of Hawaii's most powerful legal figures. The case sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the legal community, signaling that federal authorities believed corruption had reached systemic levels within the department. In 2019, both Louis and Catherine Kiloha were convicted in federal court. Catherine received a significantly longer sentence due to her central role in the financial exploitation, while Louis was sentenced for his abuse of police authority and obstruction. The convictions exposed deep institutional failures and prompted calls for oversight reforms within the Honolulu Police Department. Public trust in law enforcement was severely damaged, and internal practices came under review. The case became a defining example of how unchecked power and lack of accountability can undermine the justice system from within. Case 4. 2022, Oahu, Hawaii. Eric Thompson was charged following the fatal shooting of John Tokuhiro, a local acupuncturist whose death immediately drew public attention. The shooting did not occur during a robbery or random act of violence, but after a personal confrontation rooted in a deteriorating marriage. Investigators quickly identified Thompson as the shooter, and the case centered on whether the killing was an impulsive act driven by emotion or a deliberate, targeted decision. As evidence emerged, the incident became a focal point for examining how jealousy escalated into lethal violence. The case began when Thompson confronted Tokuhiro after discovering that his wife was involved in an extramarital relationship with him. On the day of the incident, Thompson sought out Tokuhiro rather than avoiding contact. The confrontation escalated rapidly and ended with Thompson firing multiple shots at close range. Emergency services were called, but Tokuhiro was pronounced dead at the scene. There was no evidence of a struggle that would suggest self-defense, and Thompson did not dispute that he had fired the weapon. The initial facts pointed toward a personal motive rather than an unplanned encounter, but the evidence at the scene did not support a claim of sudden or unavoidable violence. John Tokuhiro was a licensed acupuncturist who operated a local practice and was known within the community as a healthcare provider. He had no criminal history, no documented disputes, and no prior incidents involving violence. His connection to Thompson was limited to the relationship with Thompson's wife. There was no evidence that Tokuhiro had threatened Thompson or engaged in behavior that would justify fear of harm. Friends and colleagues described Tokuhiro as focused on his work and routine. His death disrupted not only his family, but also his patients and professional community. It would take only days for the investigation to challenge NY narrative that framed the shooting was accidental. Investigators analyzed ballistic evidence from the scene, confirming that the weapon used belonged to Thompson. The trajectory and placement of the wounds indicated deliberate aiming rather than defensive firing. Digital evidence, including messages and online activity, demonstrated Thompson's growing fixation on the relationship prior to the shooting. Witness statements placed Thompson at the location with intent rather than coincidence. Together, the evidence established a clear sequence of actions leading up to the confrontation. The findings suggested preparation and pursuit rather than a spontaneous reaction. Then, the case moved into a legal phase that would prove unexpectedly complex. Thompson was arrested and charged, but the first trial ended without a verdict after jurors failed to reach unanimous agreement. The deadlock centered on whether emotional distress could mitigate criminal responsibility. Prosecutors pursued a second trial, refining their presentation of evidence and focusing on intent and decision-making. During the retrial, the cumulative evidence left little ambiguity. The jury found Thompson guilty, concluding that the shooting was a targeted act rather than an uncontrollable emotional response. The conviction marked a turning point after months of uncertainty surrounding the case. Thompson was sentenced to life imprisonment with a mandatory minimum term before parole eligibility. The court emphasized that emotional distress, while explanatory, did not excuse deliberate violence. The case highlighted a recurring pattern in crimes driven by possessive jealousy, where personal relationships escalate into lethal outcomes. Public discussion following the sentencing focused on accountability and the limits of emotional justification in violent crimes. While the legal process concluded with a conviction, the case remained a reference point for how unchecked jealousy can lead to irreversible consequences. Case 5. 1997, Big Island, Hawaii. 6-year-old Peter Boy Kemma vanished from his family's home under circumstances that immediately raised concern. Relatives reported that the child was no longer present, but no missing person report was formally pursued at the time. Explanations offered by his parents shifted repeatedly, preventing immediate intervention. As weeks passed without sightings or confirmation of his whereabouts, questions mounted. What initially appeared to be a family matter gradually became one of Hawaii's most troubling unresolved child disappearance cases. The case began when family members noticed Peter Boy had not been seen for an extended period. Attempts to locate him were met with explanations that conflicted with earlier accounts. His parents claimed he had been given to another caretaker, a story that could not be verified. These explanations stood in contrast to existing records documenting previous injuries and welfare concerns. Reports from relatives described visible signs of harm prior to his disappearance, while official files showed earlier involvement by Child Protective Services. Despite these warning signs, no immediate search was launched. The absence of a formal missing person report allowed the case to stall before it truly began. Peter Boy had a documented history of injuries that had drawn the attention of authorities years earlier. Medical records showed fractures and trauma inconsistent with accidental harm. As a result, state agencies had previously intervened, temporarily removing children from the home before later returning them. Despite these actions, concerns persisted among extended family members. Peter Boy was last seen alive months before his disappearance was questioned. He lived in a household already known to social services, making his sudden absence especially troubling. The lack of consistent oversight created conditions where his disappearance could go unexplained. It would take years before these failures were fully examined. For nearly 2 decades, the investigation remained dormant. Leads went cold, and the explanation involving a supposed caretaker could not be substantiated. Renewed scrutiny years later revealed that the caretaker never existed. Investigators revisited prior reports, re-interviewed witnesses, and examined inconsistencies that had been overlooked. Financial, travel, and school records confirmed that Peter Boy had never reappeared anywhere in the state. The fabricated story unraveled under closer examination, exposing deliberate deception. This reopening marked the first real progress since the child vanished. In 2016, prosecutors presented the case to a grand jury. Both parents were indicted on charges related to their son's death. Shortly after, the mother agreed to cooperate with authorities. Her cooperation confirmed that Peter Boy had died years earlier and that his disappearance had been concealed. This admission fundamentally altered the case, transforming it from a missing child investigation into a homicide prosecution. With that confirmation, the focus shifted to accountability for years of silence and obstruction. Sentencing followed guilty pleas and agreements that spared a full trial. One parent received a prison sentence, while the other received a reduced penalty in exchange for cooperation. Civil lawsuits were later filed against state agencies, alleging systemic failures in child protection. The case prompted reviews of how abuse reports were handled and led to changes in oversight procedures. Although Peter Boy's remains were never recovered, the case forced long overdue reforms. His disappearance became a lasting example of how institutional gaps can allow harm to continue unchecked. Case 6. 2017, Oahu North Shore. Teacher Telma Bonvillain was killed during a violent home invasion at a vacation rental, shattering the sense of safety in a quiet coastal community. What was meant to be a brief getaway became the setting for an extreme act of violence that shocked residents across the island. The crime drew immediate attention due to its brutality and the presence of a child at the scene. Investigators quickly confirmed the killing was not random, but the result of a burglary that spiraled out of control. The case began when 2 intruders unlawfully entered the vacation rental where Bonvillain was staying. The break-in occurred during nighttime hours when the home was occupied. Upon encountering Bonvillain, the intruders did not flee. Instead, the situation escalated rapidly into physical violence. Multiple weapons were used during the attack, indicating sustained aggression rather than panic. Emergency services were later alerted, but Bonvillain was pronounced dead at the scene. The nature of the injuries and damage inside the home confirmed that the confrontation had intensified beyond the scope of a burglary. But the evidence at the scene suggested the violence did not end with her death. Thelma Bonvillain was an educator and mother who had traveled to the North Shore with her young daughter for a short vacation. She had no known connection to the intruders and no prior disputes. During the incident, her daughter was forcibly taken from the home by the suspects. Hours later, the child was recovered alive, abandoned at a separate location. Although physically unharmed, the circumstances raised immediate concerns about long-term trauma. Bonvillain's role as a teacher and parent amplified the community response, as residents struggled to reconcile the crime with the area's reputation for safety. It would take only days for the investigation to close in on those responsible. Investigators processed the crime scene and collected extensive forensic evidence, including DNA, weapon markings, and physical trace evidence. Witness statements placed unfamiliar individuals in the area around the time of the break-in. Surveillance footage from nearby locations captured movements consistent with the suspect's timeline. The recovered child provided additional confirmation of events, allowing investigators to establish a clear sequence. The combination of physical evidence and corroborated accounts narrowed the suspect pool rapidly. Authorities identified two individuals whose actions before and after the crime aligned with the findings. Then, law enforcement moved to make arrests. Both suspects were taken into custody and charged with multiple violent felonies, including homicide, kidnapping, and burglary. Evidence showed their involvement at every stage of the crime, from entry to flight. The charges reflected not only the killing, but the abduction of a minor and the use of extreme violence. Prosecutors emphasized the deliberate decisions made during the incident, rejecting any suggestion of accidental escalation. The arrests brought an end to the immediate threat, but the legal process highlighted the severity of the actions and their impact on the victim's family. The court ultimately imposed life sentences on both perpetrators, ensuring long-term incarceration. During sentencing, the case was cited as an example of the dangers associated with unsecured vacation properties. Public discussion followed regarding rental safety, neighborhood awareness, and preventive measures. While the convictions brought legal closure, they could not undo the loss suffered by Bonvillain's family. The case remained a defining moment for the North Shore community, reshaping conversations about safety in temporary accommodations and the lasting consequences of violent crime. Case 7, 2011, Waikiki, Hawaii. A federal agent fatally shot a local man inside a McDonald's during the early morning hours, turning a crowded public restaurant into the center of a highly contested homicide case. The shooter was identified as Christopher Deedy, a U.S. State Department agent temporarily assigned to Hawaii. The victim, a young local resident, died at the scene. The incident immediately Dr. Yeo national attention, not only because of the location, but because of the shooter's federal status. From the outset, the case raised difficult questions about authority, responsibility, and the limits of self-defense. The incident began after Deedy spent the evening drinking at multiple bars in Waikiki. In the early hours of the morning, he entered a McDonald's where several patrons were present. An interaction between Deedy and another customer escalated into a verbal confrontation. Witnesses later described raised voices and aggressive posturing. Deedy, who was carrying his service firearm despite being off duty and intoxicated, drew his weapon during the dispute. Moments later, shots were fired. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the victim was pronounced dead at the scene. Surveillance cameras captured portions of the encounter, but critical moments remained unclear. The circumstances surrounding the escalation immediately became the focus of investigation. The victim was Colin Elderts, a 23-year-old local resident. He was unarmed at the time of the shooting and had no documented history of violent behavior. Elderts had been out socializing that night and was inside the restaurant when the confrontation occurred. Investigators found no evidence that he possessed a weapon or that he posed a lethal threat. His death sparked outrage within the local community, particularly among native Hawaiian residents who viewed the incident through a broader lens of power imbalance. Eldert's family emphasized that he was a young man with no reason to be targeted with deadly force. His lack of weapon involvement became central to public scrutiny of the shooting. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and witness statements. The footage showed the lead-up to the confrontation, but did not clearly capture the precise moment when deadly force was used. Witness accounts varied, with some describing Eldertz as aggressive and others stating that Didi escalated the situation unnecessarily. Toxicology reports confirmed Didi had been drinking prior to the incident. The investigation revealed that Didi had placed himself in a volatile situation while armed and impaired. However, the lack of a single definitive narrative left room for competing interpretations. These uncertainties carried over into the courtroom. Didi was charged and brought to trial, where prosecutors argued that his actions were unjustified and reckless. The defense claimed self-defense, asserting that Didi feared serious harm. The first trial ended with a hung jury, unable to reach a unanimous verdict. A second trial followed, resulting in an acquittal on the most serious charge and hung counts on lesser offenses. With no conviction secured, prosecutors faced the decision of whether to pursue further legal action. Ultimately, the case concluded without a retrial, leaving the shooting legally unresolved. The decision not to retry the case intensified public debate across Hawaii. Many viewed the outcome as a failure of accountability, particularly given Didi's federal position. Others argued the legal process had run its course under the standard of proof required for conviction. Eldert's family expressed lasting frustration with the outcome, stating that justice had not been served. The case became a focal point for discussions about privilege, use of force, and the conduct of armed federal agents while off duty. Though the legal proceedings ended, the controversy surrounding the shooting continued to shape public discourse long afterward. Case 8. 2007, Oahu, Hawaii. Japanese tourist Masumi Watanabe disappeared while hiking alone on a popular trail, triggering an international search effort. When she failed to return or contact her family, authorities were alerted and an extensive search began across the area. Despite helicopters, volunteers, and ground teams, there were no immediate signs of her whereabouts. What initially appeared to be a missing hiker case soon shifted direction, as witness accounts suggested she may not have vanished on her own. The case began when witnesses reported seeing a distressed young woman standing beside a white pest control truck along a roadway near the trail. Several individuals described her behavior as confused and resistant, noting that she appeared to be arguing or gesturing in distress. The truck was later identified as belonging to a local pest control company. One witness recorded details about the vehicle, including markings and license information, which were later provided to police. These observations placed Watanabe outside the hiking area and suggested outside involvement. The sightings narrowed the timeline of her disappearance to a specific window that morning. This shift redirected the investigation away from a lost hiker scenario. Masumi Watanabe was a 21-year-old Japanese national visiting Hawaii as a tourist. She was traveling independently and had no friends, family, or low-NG-term connections on the island. Her itinerary showed she intended to hike alone before returning to Japan. She carried no known risks and had no prior interactions with local residents. Her unfamiliarity with the area and lack of local contacts increased her vulnerability. Investigators later confirmed she had no reason to voluntarily disappear. Her isolation and visitor status made her dependent on chance encounters, which would become central to understanding how she vanished. Investigators examined the pest control truck identified by witnesses and found blood evidence and Watanabe's personal belongings inside. Forensic analysis confirmed the blood belonged to her. Vehicle damage inconsistent with the driver's explanation further raised suspicion. Eyewitness accounts placed the truck at multiple relevant locations throughout the day. Additional testimony described a man matching the suspect's appearance digging near a coastal area later that night. License plate information and vehicle movement data linked those sightings to Kirk Langford. The accumulation of physical and testimonial evidence established a clear connection between Langford and Watanabe's disappearance. Kirk Langford was arrested within 2 weeks of Watanabe's disappearance and charged with murder. Despite the absence of a body, prosecutors moved forward based on the strength of the forensic and circumstantial evidence. At trial, Langford offered explanations that were contradicted by physical findings and expert testimony. The jury rejected his account and found him guilty. The conviction demonstrated that a homicide case could be proven without the recovery of remains when evidence was sufficiently compelling. Langford was sentenced to life imprisonment with a mandatory minimum of 150 years before parole eligibility. The sentence reflected both the severity of the crime and his refusal to disclose the location of Watanabe's remains. Her family repeatedly appealed for information that would allow her to be recovered and returned home. Despite ongoing appeals and public pressure, Langford did not cooperate. The case became a reference point for prosecutions without a body and highlighted the lasting impact on families denied physical closure. Case 9, 2020, Honolulu, Hawaii. Businessman Mike Miskee was arrested following a sweeping federal investigation that alleged he had operated a large-scale criminal enterprise for years. Known publicly as the owner of a successful pest control business, Miskee was accused of using legitimate operations to conceal extensive illegal activity. The arrest marked the collapse of an organization that investigators said relied on violence, intimidation, and financial manipulation. What followed became the most complex organized crime prosecution in Hawaii's history. The investigation intensified around a kidnapping and killing tied to long-running personal vendettas. Federal authorities focused on the death of Jonathan Fraser, whose disappearance and later discovery raised immediate red flags. Investigators alleged that the killing was not an isolated act, but part of a broader pattern of retaliation connected to past disputes involving Miskee and his associates. As detectives examined the circumstances, they identified links between the crime and a network of individuals operating under Miskee's direction. The case expanded rapidly, moving beyond a single homicide into a wide-ranging probe of coordinated criminal conduct. Evidence suggested planning, surveillance, and execution consistent with organized activity. What began as a targeted homicide investigation soon revealed the outlines of a much larger enterprise. Jonathan Fraser's death became the central thread connecting Miskee to violent retaliation networks. Prosecutors alleged that Fraser was targeted as part of an ongoing cycle of revenge rooted in earlier conflicts. Fraser was not described as a random victim, but as someone drawn into a dispute that escalated far beyond its origin. His killing was presented as a deliberate act meant to assert control and send a message. Investigators identified patterns in how similar acts had been carried out, linking Fraser's death to other incidents involving intimidation and coercion. The victim's fate illustrated how personal vendettas were allegedly absorbed into a larger system of organized violence. Federal agents employed wiretaps, cooperating witnesses, and financial analysis to map the scope of the organization. Recorded communications captured coded language referring to criminal acts, payments, and enforcement measures. Witnesses who had previously operated within the network agreed to cooperate, describing how orders were communicated and carried out. Financial tracing revealed money moving through shell companies and legitimate businesses to conceal illicit proceeds. Investigators documented years of activity involving threats, assaults, and obstruction. The evidence portrayed a structured enterprise rather than isolated crimes. As the case progressed, the volume of material collected became unprecedented for a Hawaii prosecution. Miskee was arrested along with numerous associates and charged under federal racketeering statutes. The trial lasted 6 months and involved hundreds of exhibits and extensive testimony. Prosecutors presented evidence tying Miskee directly to decision-making within the enterprise. The defense challenged witness credibility and argued that the government relied on circumstantial evidence. After deliberation, the jury convicted Miskee on all counts. The verdict represented a significant victory for federal authorities and appeared to bring closure to years of investigation into organized crime operating in plain sight. Before sentencing could occur, Miskee died while in federal custody. His death triggered a legal consequence that vacated the conviction under existing precedent, as sentencing and appeals had not been completed. The outcome sparked controversy and frustration among victims' families, who had endured months of testimony. While the conviction was nullified, many of Miskee's associates remained imprisoned under separate judgments. The case dismantled the organization, but left unresolved questions about accountability, ending one of Hawaii's largest prosecutions without formal sentencing. Case 10. December 25, 2016, Honolulu, Hawaii. A fatal shooting disrupted Christmas night at a Lamona Center, one of the busiest shopping complexes in the state. As families gathered for holiday celebrations, gunfire echoed through a parking structure, instantly turning a routine evening into a homicide scene. One young man was left fatally wounded, and the suspect fled into the night. The timing and location of the killing drew immediate public attention, as investigators worked to determine how a holiday gathering place became the site of lethal violence. The case began with a confrontation inside the Lamona Center parking garage during the late evening hours. Witnesses reported raised voices followed by a single gunshot. Stevie Feliciano was struck in the back of the head and collapsed at the scene. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but he was pronounced dead shortly after. The suspect fled before officers arrived. Surveillance footage captured portions of the encounter, showing individuals meeting in the garage prior to the shooting. Investigators determined the confrontation was not random, but the result of a planned meeting. The positioning of the wound indicated Feliciano had been shot from behind, contradicting any immediate claim of self-defense. Stevie Feliciano was a young man whose activities that night placed him in contact with individuals involved in criminal circles. Investigators later confirmed the meeting in the garage was connected to an illicit transaction. Feliciano was not armed at the time of the shooting. His family described him as someone who had made mistakes but did not deserve to lose his life in such a manner. The killing devastated his relatives, particularly due to the date, permanently altering how the family experienced the holiday season. His death underscored the risks associated with disputes tied to criminal associations. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage from the parking structure and surrounding roads, tracking the suspect's movements before and after the shooting. Witness testimony placed Dehan Moon at the scene. Additional evidence showed that the vehicle Moon used that night was later found burned, an apparent attempt to destroy evidence. Registration records, forensic analysis, and witness accounts linked the vehicle to Moon despite the arson. Authorities reconstructed Moon's movements over the following days, confirming efforts to avoid capture. The combination of video evidence and physical findings provided a clear investigative timeline. After 5 days, Moon surrendered to authorities. During questioning, investigators confronted him with surveillance footage and forensic evidence. He was charged with murder and related offenses. As the case developed, law enforcement uncovered links between Moon and a broader criminal network operating in Honolulu. These connections suggested the shooting was not an isolated incident, but part of a wider pattern of violence connected to organized criminal activity. The surrender ended the manhunt, but expanded the scope of the investigation. Moon was later convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment with a mandatory minimum term. The sentencing emphasized the deliberate nature of the shooting and the attempt to conceal evidence afterward. Years later, the case intersected with the federal prosecution of Mike Miskee, where Moon's actions were referenced as part of a larger network of violence. The connection reinforced the view that the Christmas night killing was influenced by an environment where disputes were resolved through lethal force. The case closed with Moon incarcerated, while Fee Lishano's family continued to carry the loss forward.